Tonight, we're learning new details in the death of legendary actor Gene Hackman.
Deaths of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife, whose bodies were found in their Santa Fe home.
1425 Old Sunset Trail, where Gene Hackman, 95, and his wife Betsy Arakawa, 65, and a dog were found deceased.
The news broke on a Tuesday morning, quietly, the way news sometimes does when it carries something too heavy to announce loudly. Gene Hackman, two-time Oscar winner, one of the most respected actors in the history of American cinema, had been found dead inside his New Mexico home. And then, almost without warning, something shifted. Because within hours, the story stopped being just about his death. It became about what investigators found when they started looking more closely. A tunnel, hidden, running beneath the property. That single detail landed differently than anything else. Not because tunnels are impossible on large private estates, but because of the man whose name was attached to it. Gene Hackman had spent the last 2 decades of his life doing everything possible to disappear. No interviews, no public appearances, no digital footprint of any kind. Just chosen, deliberate silence. The kind that feels less like retirement and more like a decision made at the bone level. So when federal investigators began moving through his property, when reports surfaced about structural elements that had never been disclosed, about questions being raised regarding the timeline of events, and the things that lay beneath the surface, both literally and in every other sense, the public found itself without a frame for what it was being told. Nobody quite knew how to hold it, not even the people who thought they had known him. Was this a man so committed to privacy that he built it into the very ground beneath his feet? Or was something else living in that silence? Something more complicated, more layered, more resistant to easy explanation? The questions didn't stop coming. They multiplied, the way questions do when the person who could answer them is no longer there. Gene Hackman was never meant to be a movie star. That wasn't a modest claim. It was, by most accounts, the honest verdict of the people who evaluated him early in his career. Too rough, too real. Not the kind of face that sold tickets. His energy was considered too unpolished, too interior, too hard to package. He was told, in ways both direct and indirect, that the industry didn't quite have a place for him. And for a while, it seemed like the industry might have been right. Then came The French Connection in 1971, and the entire conversation changed. He played Detective Jimmy Popeye Doyle. Not a hero, exactly, but something more dangerous than that. A man who operated on instinct and aggression and a kind of righteous brutality that the film never quite endorsed and never quite condemned. The performance was raw in a way that caught people off guard. It made audiences sit forward. It made them uncomfortable in a way they couldn't immediately name, and it won him the Oscar. Almost overnight, he became one of the most sought-after actors working anywhere in Hollywood. That transformation, from told you're not enough to undeniable, was the kind of story the industry loved to tell about itself. But Gene Hackman never told it that way. He didn't seem to collect the win the way other people might have. He took the work seriously. Deeply seriously, in a way that was evident in every frame he inhabited. And then he stepped back from everything else. He didn't court fame. He didn't feed the machinery of celebrity. He showed up when there was work to do and withdrew when there wasn't. That pattern held for decades, all the way through his second Oscar win for Unforgiven in 1993, and into a slow, deliberate diminishment of his public presence that most people at the time read as grace. By the early 2000s, the withdrawal had become something closer to total. He moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the film industry faded behind him like a skyline in a rearview mirror. He painted, he co-wrote novels. He was spotted occasionally at local spots around the city, reportedly warm when approached, but brief. He never invited extended conversation. He never left the door open. The people of Santa Fe seemed to understand that, seemed to honor it without being asked. There was something about the desert that matched the shape of the life he was trying to build. wide and quiet and unmoved by the noise of other people's expectations. That image, a great man at rest, at peace, in a place that suited him, held firm for years. It was a comfortable story, and it seemed to be true. And then came February 2025, and the comfortable story stopped being enough. Long before the investigations, long before the reports, there was just a man and a piece of land and a distance he had spent most of his life perfecting. The Santa Fe property itself was not incidental. According to what was later reported, Hackman had put real thought into choosing it, scouting the area deliberately, considering what the land offered in terms of privacy, proximity to roads, visibility from neighboring properties. The house sat back from public access. The surrounding land created a buffer that was both practical and symbolic, a physical expression of a principle he had lived by professionally, personally, and apparently architecturally. You can be present in the world. You can even be famous inside it, and still keep the most essential part of yourself somewhere no one can reach. His wife, Betsy Arakawa, a classically trained pianist he had married in 1991, was the one constant companion of those years. She was, by all accounts, every bit as private as he was. They were almost never photographed together. No joint interviews existed. No public events marked their shared life. They inhabited their Santa Fe existence as a unit that had quietly opted out of the whole enterprise of public couplehood. There was something almost deliberate about the invisibility they maintained together, though at the time it read as nothing more than the choice of two people who had earned the right to live without an audience. The deeper picture, though, was more complicated than peace. According to people who had worked alongside Hackman during his Hollywood years, colleagues who tried in the years after his retirement to maintain some form of contact, the withdrawal had hardened over time into something that didn't feel like rest. Phone calls went unreturned for months, then stopped being returned at all. Invitations arrived and disappeared without acknowledgement. It wasn't anger. It wasn't some publicized falling out. It was subtler than that, and in some ways harder to accept. A kind of comprehensive turning away that left people who genuinely cared about him holding an unease they had no language for. They respected his limits. They always had. But the unease didn't go away. It just went quiet and waited. The discovery of his death in February 2025 did not begin with family. It did not come through the channels that normally carry news of someone's passing. A call from a loved one, a statement from a representative. According to reports, it came through a welfare check. Someone on the outside had noticed that the silence felt different this time. Not the chosen silence of a private man in a private home, but something heavier, something wrong. When investigators entered the property, they found Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy both deceased. Neither had been discovered for some time. The exact period became a matter of scrutiny. Early accounts suggested days, and that detail alone was enough to stop people cold. The medical findings, as they emerged, carried their own quiet devastation. Betsy Arakawa's death, according to reports, appeared to be connected to hantavirus, a serious respiratory illness transmitted through rodent exposure, a real and documented risk in the desert Southwest. Gene Hackman's death was attributed to cardiac causes, but the timeline, according to accounts citing forensic analysis, raised a particular kind of sorrow. There were indications, investigators suggested, that he may have been alive for some period after his wife's death, unaware that she was gone, unaware of what had already happened in the same house around him, before his own body gave out. That image settles into you and doesn't move. A man in a house, his partner already gone, and no one close enough to know. And then, alongside the grief and the medical reports, something else began to surface. Not loudly, not in official statements, but in the way information sometimes travels, through reporting, through sources familiar with the investigation, through the specific language investigators use when they don't want to say more than they know. There were structural elements of the property, according to these accounts, that had not been publicly known. Underground construction. Things built with intention, over time, that didn't appear in standard property records and hadn't been disclosed. The FBI's involvement was mentioned in early reports. Questions were raised, appropriately, carefully, about the nature of what had been found, about when certain structures had been built and what purpose they served. No official conclusions were announced. No charges were filed. The matter, by available accounts, remained a subject of examination rather than accusation. But the questions, once they existed, couldn't be unasked. They lodged in the story and stayed there. To understand why the tunnel became significant, why it couldn't be set aside as architectural trivia, it helps to understand something about the psychology of extreme privacy. Not ordinary privacy, the kind most people practice. Something more consuming. Most people who value their solitude do so in recognizable ways. They guard their personal life. They limit access. They draw clear lines around what they share and with whom. These are normal human impulses, especially in people who've spent decades under public scrutiny. But there is another kind, one that doesn't stop at personal limits and begins to express itself in the environment itself, in the structure of things, in what gets built underground, out of sight, in the space between the world and wherever a person has decided to truly live. According to accounts that circulated in the weeks after the discovery, the tunnel beneath the property was not a utility feature or a simple passage. It was, by those reports, more deliberately constructed. Its dimensions, its purpose, the intention behind its existence all notable enough that investigators wanted to understand it more fully. No official statement confirmed specifics. No formal finding detailed its contents or use. The matter remained, as far as public information allowed, officially open. But context adds weight to everything. Gene Hackman had spoken in rare interviews from his years of semi-retirement about feeling uncomfortable with the way modern culture treated exposure as a virtue, about surveillance, about the steady erosion of spaces where a person could exist without being perceived. He had, in at least one recorded conversation, described the value of places that lived entirely outside anyone else's awareness. That sentiment, read against the discovery of hidden underground construction on his property, takes on a resonance that's difficult to simply set aside, even in the absence of any official determination of wrongdoing. It bears saying clearly, the presence of a tunnel on private property is not evidence of anything illegal. Wealthy landowners build unusual structures for reasons that range from security to climate control to simple eccentricity. Investigators, according to available reporting, did not publicly declare the tunnel to be connected to any criminal activity. No such connection was formally established. But investigation, by its nature, turns everything into a question when the circumstances of a death are not immediately clear. And in this case, the questions multiplied not from what was found inside the structure, but from what it represented. Another layer underneath the surface. Another distance maintained between the man and the world he had spent a lifetime holding at arm's length. There was a former colleague, unnamed in reporting, speaking to a journalist in the weeks after the deaths became public, who described working with Gene Hackman as one of the most disorienting professional experiences of their life. Disorienting not because he was difficult, but because of the extremity of the contrast. On set, they said, he was completely present. His attention was total. He brought a level of honest, unguarded intensity to the work that felt almost like exposure, like watching something private happen in public. And then the scene ended, and the door closed, and the person who had just given so much of himself was simply gone. That pattern, total presence in the work, total absence everywhere else, runs through nearly every account of him. His performances were intimate in a way that was almost hard to watch. He gave real things to the camera. He didn't perform emotion. He located it somewhere genuine inside himself and let it happen. And yet the man doing all of that remained, in every other context, entirely sealed. The characters he played were knowable. He was not. There is a concept sometimes used in discussions of public figures, a kind of managed disclosure, where someone offers enough genuine access to satisfy the public's appetite without surrendering anything that actually matters to them. You give the audience something true, something that registers as real, and in doing so, you redirect attention away from the deeper self you've decided to protect. Whether Gene Hackman was doing this consciously, whether it was strategy or simply nature, is impossible to say. But the effect was consistent across his entire career. You came away from his performances feeling like you'd seen something honest. You came away from the man himself knowing nothing. The tunnel, viewed through that lens, stops being a mystery about construction and becomes something else entirely. It becomes the physical form of a principle that governed his whole life, the need for a space that was truly his, unreachable, undisclosed, outside the reach of anyone who might have otherwise found a way in. His son, Christopher Hackman, released a statement in the days following the deaths. It was short, it was careful, and underneath its restraint, it carried something unmistakable, the specific weight of a love that had existed alongside distance for most of a lifetime. He described a complicated relationship. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Anyone who has spent years on the other side of a wall that someone they love chose to build, waiting, wondering, finding ways to accept what couldn't be changed, understood exactly what that brevity contained. That statement did something the rest of the coverage couldn't. It made it human. It reminded everyone that the story wasn't just about tunnels and investigations and the strange architecture of a private man's private estate. It was about the people who tried to stay close to him and found, over and over, that close was never quite close enough. As the weeks passed and the initial wave of reporting slowed, a clearer shape began to emerge from everything that had surfaced. Less conspiracy, more complexity, less hidden crime, more hidden life, and the particular silence that descends when a hidden life ends with no one nearby to witness it. The FBI's involvement, according to later reporting, appeared to be procedural in nature. Standard protocol when a high-profile death involves unexplained circumstances and structural discoveries that require examination. No indictments followed. No formal connection between the tunnel and any illegal activity was publicly established. The matter remained, in official terms, without conclusion. But conclusions aren't always what a story needs to matter. The questions the discovery raised were meaningful not because they pointed toward wrongdoing, but because they pointed toward truth. A truth about a man who spent his life in pursuit of a particular kind of freedom. The freedom to exist outside of scrutiny, outside of narrative, outside of anyone else's need to understand him, and who ultimately achieved it so completely that even the end of his life happened beyond the edges of the world he had left behind. The welfare check came too late. The questions arrived after the fact, the way they always do when someone has already gone. What was the tunnel for? Maybe security. Maybe an expression of the same impulse that had driven every other choice he made, privacy taken as far as the physical world would allow. Maybe something no one will ever fully know, because the person who knew it chose, as he always had, to keep it to himself. According to reports, investigators found no official evidence of criminal activity connected to the structure. But the absence of criminal evidence doesn't dissolve the larger meaning. It just leaves it sitting there, unresolved, the way certain things about certain lives always will. There is something genuinely difficult to hold in the image of a man who spent a lifetime building walls and died alone inside them. Something that resists the kind of narrative arc that usually shapes stories like this one. Something that doesn't wrap up or resolve or teach a clean lesson. It just asks to be thought about. We are drawn to the people who withdraw. There's a particular romance attached to the idea. The artist who earns the right to leave and takes it, who walks away from the noise and finds some quieter version of himself on the other side. We project contentment onto that choice. Peace, wisdom. The earned reward of someone who gave enough to the world and decided at some point that enough was enough. Gene Hackman's life in Santa Fe looked exactly like that story from the outside. A brilliant, difficult, exceptional man at rest in a place that suited him. And maybe that was part of what it was. Maybe some of the peace was real. He painted, he wrote, he lived in a landscape that asked nothing of him. That isn't nothing. But the full shape of the story. The children kept at arm's length, the colleagues who stopped being able to reach him, the hidden infrastructure, the death that went unnoticed for days in a house where two people had been living. That shape isn't a story about peace. It's a story about something harder. About the hunger for privacy that slowly outgrows its original purpose. About the walls that start as protection and end as something more permanent. About the difference between choosing solitude and becoming trapped inside it, and how difficult it can be, from the inside, to know which one you're doing. The work survives. That part is clean and certain. The French Connection. Unforgiven. The Royal Tenenbaums. Dozens of performances that will outlast any investigation, any tunnel, any unanswered question. He put something genuine into all of them. Something that can't be hidden or undone or reinterpreted in light of everything that came after. That version of Gene Hackman was fully present. That version was never sealed away. But the man who made those performances, the one who went to the desert and built a life no one could see into and died before the world even knew to look, that version stays partially beyond reach. Maybe that was the intention. Maybe the unanswered questions are the final act of a man who spent everything he had on keeping the deepest part of himself private. Or maybe, in the end, the walls that gave him safety also kept out the very things that might have mattered most. A knock on the door, a voice in the hall, someone close enough to notice that the silence had changed. We will not know which it was. That uncertainty is real, and it deserves to be held rather than resolved. It's the most honest thing left of him. If you're watching here for the first time, and this felt like the kind of storytelling you want more of, subscribing means more of this is on its way.